system, the dopaminergic system that we're talking about, anticipation and then action and reward, or in some cases, no reward, right? And the ability to persist toward a goal regardless, is a generalizable system. You had that chapter about, get your room in order, right? Get your belongings in order. This is, I think, very relevant right now. Even though it's important to have higher goals and lofty goals, the dopamine system is an incredible system because it is depletable, and yet it's also renewable, and it is self-amplifying. What I mean by that is, let's say that I'm somebody who doesn't know what I'm working toward. I don't have a specific goal or question. By completing even what seem like menial tasks, like making myself a cup of coffee, drinking it, cleaning up completely, drying the cup and putting it back in the cupboard, what happens is, even if you make that seemingly trivial goal the goal, in addition to making the kitchen look nicer, it completes a circuit. It closes the dopaminergic circuit. And when dopamine is released, and it will be, maybe not to the same extent as publishing a novel, but to some extent, dopamine amplifies our ability to think into the future, to make additional plans that are unrelated to what you just did, and it literally increases confidence and energy. Why? Well, for the following reason. We all think about caloric energy, but what most people are never taught, and if I had 10 things I could teach people, one of them would be adrenaline, epinephrine, is neural energy. It's your ability to get up and go. It's the thing that makes you jittery when you're a little nervous, but it's also what allows you to move forward, to go out for a run, to pursue any goal, cognitive or physical, etc. Epinephrine, which is also adrenaline, those are the same thing, is literally manufactured from the molecule dopamine. If you look at the biochemical cascade, it is dopamine is converted into adrenaline, which is the basis of all energy, all neural energy. Right. And so, including thinking. And so if one is not in a place of being able to set their goal on a particular lofty goal, a graduate degree, a book, et cetera, yet, the way one gets to that is by completing things in their immediate environment from start to finish and closing the dopaminergic loop. You literally...
Yeah, well, those are at least micro narratives.
That's right.
Right, so they're not integrated across a long span of time, but they're not nothing. And so one of the things, well, I did write about this in my first book, particularly about putting your house in perfect order. It's like, well, if you're lost, one of the things you can do is look around and see what direction you could take locally, is fix something. And I used to tell my clients, this is a very good thing to know. Find something that you could do that would make things better that you would do. And there's a humility in that too, because especially if you're in a low energy state, it's like, oh my God, I don't have enough energy to make dinner. It's like, do you have enough energy to put a fork on the table? And sometimes people are so depressed that that's really all they can do. It's like, can you take a small step forward, no matter how small that is? And so I knew that adrenaline was a byproduct or down the biochemical chain from dopamine, but I didn't get the significance of that fully. So basically what you're saying is that if you implement a micro routine, even something like washing a cup and putting it back in the shelf, and that's a good thing because you have a shelf and there's cups on it, you've already decided that's an appropriate way to live, is to have your coffee cups on a shelf. If you go ahead with cleaning out the cup and putting it on the shelf, then you've taken steps towards a valuable micro goal. You get a dopamine kick from that. That transforms itself into adrenaline and energizes you.
Which then...
So that's partly the reason that it has an antidepressant effect.
That's right. And then you can lean into another behavior. I mean, some of the more successful classes of antidepressants, again, not for everybody, are the ones of the dopaminergic, adrenalinergic variety, right? Things like bupropion, as opposed to, there's a lot of debate about SSRIs. They tap into a different system. You asked about gene expression changes. There's neuroplasticity, which is on the short scale. Completion of an even trivial task like the putting away of the cup will give you more dopamine, which gives you more adrenaline, which in this analogy of either being back on one's heels, flat-footed, or forward center of mass, regardless of where one is starting out, let's say depressed is back on one's heels, it's going to tilt you forward a little bit. And then it's a question of what you do with it. So the cognitive appraisal is critical because, again, with the prefrontal cortex being so critical in establishing which of these loops gets repeated, the cognitive appraisal is critical. I'm somebody who can get things done, even if they're small. Now, if you do the cognitive appraisal...
Or you can take another cognitive appraisal there too, which is, it's small things are not small.
That's right.
Precisely for the reason that we just described. It's like you might have the cognitive appraisal that doing something local, like cleaning up your room, is small, but it's not obvious at all that that's the case. It's not that trivial to put your immediate surroundings in order. And it can easily be the stepping stone to putting things in order on a broader scale. In fact, it's probably the necessary stepping stone to do that. And so they might seem small, but they're a step ahead, and ahead is a good direction.
Absolutely.
And so they're not as small as you might think. And so you can pat yourself on the back, especially if you're depressed, a little harder than you might otherwise by saying, you say, well, this is trivial, but I did it. It's like, no, if you're moving ahead, tilting yourself forward in your metaphor, that's not small. You just keep doing that, you're going to get out of this paralyzed or retreat mode. And then God only knows what you're going to be able to do.
That's right. And I think that if people were to look at these neurological and psychological processes, because we're really talking about both, is as algorithms, right? These are algorithms that have been used by every animal. Think about the animal that's foraging for food. They go down one path, they're surprised they find food. They go down another path, they're sure they're on a scent. They are sure, and then they get nothing. Well, what happens? They learn to remember, they automatically remember everything that led to that failure. And people are very good at remembering that.
Yeah.
But be good at remembering the things that led to successes and then ride those neurochemical waves to the next node of exploration. You're talking about exploration versus anxiety.
You can also do this with people in your environment. This is something B.F. Skinner pointed out when he was training animals. Said you can use threat and punishment to train animals. But he said the most effective mode of training isn't that at all. You use sustained attention and reward. And so imagine that you're training a rat to climb up a ladder rung by rung and then do a little dance on the top and then climb down the other side. So what Skinner would do, his animals were hungry, by the way. They were starved to 75% of their body weight. So they were pretty dopaminergically motivated by the provision of any food. He would watch them wander around in the cage where a ladder was, let's say, a little rat monkey bar apparatus. And then when the rat would get near the ladder, he'd give it a food pellet. So then it was soon spending a lot of time near the ladder. And now and then, while it was monkeying about, it would put one foot on one paw on the first rung. It was like food pellet. And then it would soon be doing that. And then sooner or later, it would put the next paw on and he'd reward it. And so Skinner trained pigeons to pilot guided missiles by pecking on photos in relationship to the ground they were watching. Right, so
Spectacular.
He could use reward in an unbelievable. So one of the things you can do in your local environment and with yourself as well is you can watch people around you and you can see when they make small steps towards manifesting some behaviors you'd like to see a lot more of. And then you can tell them in this very differentiated, discriminatory manner, you can say, hey, look, here's the sequence of actions you just undertook. I saw that. I noted the process. And here's the delightful outcome. Good work. And man, if you do that repeatedly to people around you, and you don't want to do this in a fake or manipulative way, but if you're attentive to what people are doing that's good, and you mark that with a reward, man, you produce behavioral transformations at a rate that's just beyond belief.
I love it.
And everyone feels great about it too. Yeah, it's really a good habit, man. It's giving credit where, that's separating the wheat from the chaff in the truest sense. To give credit where credit is due.
Yeah, the behavior.
And you can imagine you're facilitating growth in the manner that you just described. And maybe neurological or genetic transformation. We didn't get to the gene expression part yet.
Yeah, the behaviorists like Skinner were truly brilliant. And I think one experiment that I think is worth mentioning, which is kind of speaks to the power of dopamine and why it's so vital to tap into these systems, even through menial tasks, and then to build on their self-amplifying mode so that you can take on bigger things in life, so to speak, positive goals. There's a classic experiment now that's been done in humans and in animals where you take two rats, separate cages, or you could do this with humans where they're naturalistic conditions where one of the rats or humans actually has their dopamine depleted. In humans, this happens through Parkinsonian things or the ingestion of drugs which accidentally deplete the dopaminergic neurons. And what you find is that if you give them an opportunity to experience something pleasureful, like hit a lever and get a pellet of food, or people to access some very tasty food, both people with dopamine and with very depleted dopamine, animals with dopamine or without dopamine will eat the food. They will pursue the food, but only if it's right in front of them. if you put any kind of task between a person or an animal and a reward, what you find is that a rat won't move one rat's length to press a lever to get the food. So they are able to experience pleasure, but what they are unable to do is to embark on any kind of effort to achieve that pleasure.
Right. So that's so cool. So that means that in part what the dopamine system is doing. So imagine that the purpose of the dopamine system is to elicit a satiating reward. That's right, fundamentally. But then the satiating reward is something that has to be approached in steps.
That's right.
And so in order to maintain the motivation necessary to approach the satiating reward, you have to mark each of the steps with a marker of pleasure. And so the dopamine system is marking the intermediary steps. And then it's doing that to overcome the reluctance that you'd have to expend the energy in that micro routine that would otherwise be costly, by calculating the fact that there's a net reward that's nested in the ultimate satiation.
That's right.
And parsing that out across the,
And sometimes people will experience tremendous anxiety in pursuit of their rewards. You know, the social situation or the goal or the book, or, you know, people imagine failure like crazy, as I'm sure, you know, we've all heard and seen. What's critical, again, is this cognitive appraisal, this interpretation of that. If you think of that anxiety as a natural system of getting you to move, of just biasing your body toward movement, toward action, as opposed to inaction, because that's what anxiety really is. It's a bias toward action. Then you can literally reshape the whole notion of what it feels like to have elevated heart rate, maybe trembling hands, maybe flushing of the face when one is doing public speaking. You do it enough times, you get pretty comfortable. Now, there are situations in life, I should just mention, such as sleep deprivation or in particular, that tend to make this whole set of systems with prefrontal cortex and limbic stuff and ACC and insula kind of dysregulated. It makes it harder to manage. That goes without saying, right? You know, the quickest way to peel somebody apart is to sleep deprive them for 2 or 3 nights. One night, you're probably fine.
Right.
So, you know, all the basics of self-care, of good nutrition, social connection, sleep, exercise, sunlight, those still apply. I just want to mention that. I want to make sure I answer your question about gene expression and permanent changes, because I've failed to do that thus far. One of the things that is absolutely key about the dopamine system is that it has a fast component. Dopamine is released, more adrenaline, aka epinephrine, can be released, and you can, this sort of upward spiral of energy and sort of success with the occasional drops, right? I mean, nobody succeeds in every task, right? Sometimes the phone rings or the doorbell rings and you fail. Goodness, you fail to clean the cup. You come home, like, are you going to crash into a puddle of tears? No, you just clean it then and then put it away, right? Of course. But there's a slow system associated with achieving wins, even small wins. And that slow system is in the form of hormonal control that then translates to gene control. So 2 hormones in particular, testosterone and estrogen, which are present in both men and women, males and females, of course, but to varying degrees, are both secreted when the dopamine system is activated. This has to do with the relationship between dopaminergic neurons and the pituitary gland, which releases gonadotropins and luteinizing hormones, which then stimulate the testes and the ovaries, et cetera, to release the so-called sex steroid hormones. The sex steroid hormones, testosterone and estrogen, of course, are involved in reproductive biology, but they are both vitally important, provided they are in the proper ratios, for motivational biology, and for the following reason. The steroid hormones are so-called lipophilic, and they can cross from the outside of a cell through the cell membrane to actually into the nucleus of a cell and control gene expression. So when we achieve wins repeatedly, and again, this doesn't matter if you're male or female, you achieve wins repeatedly. Testosterone is the molecule that eventually accesses not just cells to control their immediate physiology, but goes into the nucleus of those cells and controls their gene expression. And what it translates...
So does that mean, does that mean that demotivated men are producing less testosterone?
We can say that the data show that repeated failures take testosterone levels lower than they would be otherwise. That is not to say that people with low testosterone will always fail. Those with higher testosterone will always win. But just to be clear, because you are correct, but people sometimes get hitched on this causal part. But indeed, one of the quickest ways to boost someone's testosterone is to have them achieve a win. of some sort. Now the win is translated.
Well, one of the things you do in behavior therapy constantly is you help people calibrate the zone of proximal development. So imagine that's Vygotsky's term, right? And so if you're in the zone of proximal development, you're pushing your skill development one increment forward. And it's one that you can actually manage. And so if you see people who are entirely stymied, we're sort of back to the cup of coffee or the coffee cup example, you want to find something they can do locally this week that would constitute at least a micro win. And you just keep, and if you talk to someone, you say, well, why don't you try cleaning up your room? Because it's a complete catastrophic nightmare. It's a good place to start. This is often the case with people who are really demoralized and whose life is utterly chaotic. And maybe they come back later and say, well, you know, like I had one client, he just had a child, and he didn't want to mess up this child, but he was living at home. He was like 35 years old. He had a child out of wedlock by accident, but he didn't want to be a useless father. And he was very afraid he was going to be. And he had good reason to. Like, he still lived at home. He lived in his high school bedroom, and it was a complete bloody mess. He was living like a 12-year-old, you know, a bad 12-year-old. And so I said, well, when was the last time that your carpet was vacuumed? And he said, well, sometimes my mother does it, but it's probably been months. I said, well, why don't you just bring the vacuum cleaner into the room and just vacuum your carpet? That'll be your task for this week. You know, and I knew that was a bigger task than you might think, because he'd been in that room for like 18 years and it was a mess. And so cleaning it up at all was a big deal. He told me that he dragged that bloody vacuum cleaner into the doorway and left it 45 degrees across the doorway, and then stepped over it for the whole week without actually using it.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, resistance, that was resistance from a psychoanalytic perspective, because he saw the monster and was paralyzed. And so what we did was we reduced the task. I said, look, you've got some drawers in your bureau. They're probably a mess. Do you have a sock drawer? Yes. It said, like, clean up one half of the sock drawer this week. That's it, just organize it. So you just keep cutting the tasks down week by week until you find the threshold for positive movement forward. And then what's cool about that too is there's a Pareto principle issue associated with it. So if you can find out where the person can start, it isn't linear progress, it's exponential progress forward. And so even if they have to start at a micro level, it doesn't really matter, because they get much better at it very, very rapidly as they accrue successes. Maybe that's because they're learning in the way that you described.